Today, I'm very happy to welcome one of ours, because Victor, there is no collusion, by the way, on this, in this club, but Victor just happened to be the first vice president of the club, and he's also on the committee that decides who talks at these lunches. But there was unanimity that his book was well worth the time. So for those of you who don't know, Victor is a well-established journalist, commentator, author. He's been in Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Africa for 30 years. He's currently the Asia news editor for the Financial Times. He was bureau chief in South Asia, based in New Delhi. And he was in Hong Kong before that as well. He published several books, including The Trouble with Tigers in 1999. And this new book that he's going to talk to us about has been very highly praised and welcome. And I think it's fantastic to hear about long-term, deep problems of the planet as opposed to, very quickly disappearing news. So please welcome Victor Mallet.
Thank you very much to all of you for coming. And I think the fact that there's so many of you here is a tribute to two things, really. One is the importance of the subject, and the other is the persuasive powers of Michelle, my wife, who is somewhere here. Forgotten where she's somewhere on this table, right? Where is she? Anyway, she's a very persuasive person. And thank you all for coming. Now, as Eric Newby, the author of a wonderful travel book called Slowly Down the Ganges, once said, "I love rivers." And this book that we're talking about today is about what I argue is the world's most important river. We all, I think we all instinctively know that rivers are fundamental to life and civilization, and almost all the great cities of the world are built at rivers, river mouths like this one on the Pearl River Delta, or at river confluences, or on river banks. And you just have to think London, Paris, Cologne, Shanghai. So, that's the centrality of rivers. We do have, as Florence mentioned, we have plenty of other pressing concerns right now in the world. North Korea, Donald Trump, Brexit, climate change, plastic in the oceans. But I think that the fate of our rivers should be right up there among these significant issues. In fact, a lot of the plastics in our oceans actually comes down these very rivers, including the Pearl River, as you'll know if you look at Lama's beaches and see the amount of plastic that collects there every day. So of all the environmental, political, social, economic issues that face the world today, I do think that fresh water and the fate of the world's great rivers are really among the most important. Now, this book is not entirely gloomy. It is a celebration of the Ganges as well as a lament. The Ganges is arguably the world's most famous river, and certainly I think the most important. It has a place in culture and history, from the great epics of Indian literature to Bollywood movies, but also in Western literature. Most of those references I try to pick up, or some of them I try to pick up in the book, although of course I keep stumbling across new places where the Ganges is mentioned and used as a symbol or as an example. So it's a celebration, this book, of everything, the rich wildlife as well as the culture and the history of the rich wildlife that can be found in and around the Ganges, from tigers to freshwater dolphins that you can see far up the river, gharials, those wonderful crocodiles with the very long snouts, bird life, amphibians, you name it, fish, it's all there. But it is also, this book is a celebration, but it's also a plea for help and a call to save the river before it's too late, and to stop the Ganges, which is known as Ganga in most Indian languages, from suffering the same fate as the Thames in London once did, or the Chicago River in the US, or countless rivers in East Asia, from the tiny Sungay Seget in Johor to the great rivers of China. So all rivers, yes, are important, but the reason I argue that the Ganges is the most important is really twofold. It's true that, first of all, that it's holy to 1 billion or more Hindus in India and around the world. Ganga is a goddess who purifies The waters of the Ganga are the waters in which, as a Hindu, you want your ashes to be scattered when you die. You want to be cremated on the banks of the Ganga, preferably at Varanasi, and then your ashes put in the river and washed down to the sea across North India. In fact, I mean, India, the word India itself derives from the Sanskrit word for a large river. So in a way, India means river country, and to be an Indian is to be essentially a river person. And Hindus will keep bottles or jars of Ganga Jal, that's Ganges water, at home for religious ceremonies. And you can even buy it on eBay if you want, if you haven't been able to go to the Ganga and buy and bring it back for yourself. But the Ganges is also important for less spiritual reasons. Hundreds of millions of people live along it or in the floodplain. They're nourished by its waters and, above all, by the fertile silt that the river brings down from the Himalayas and the foothills of the Himalayas. And that's why India has always been one of the most populous places on earth, and actually one of the richest as well. And that wealth, and you may be surprised to hear that if you know about modern India, but that wealth, that historical and prehistoric wealth of India, is why the Mughals came from Central Asia to invade. It's why the British landed in Calcutta on the banks of one of the distributaries of the Ganga as it goes into the sea on the Hooghly River in the 17th century, and why they made Calcutta the capital of British India. And India, if you look back at the statistical calculations that people like Angus Maddison have done, India once accounted for a quarter of world GDP, a larger share even than China, and not many people remember this. It wasn't just China that was a big economy before the Industrial Revolution, it was also India. So I think the numbers were something like India was 25% and China was 23% at that time, about 1,000 years ago. Now, Hong Kong, where we are now, is also connected to Indian history via the Ganges. And again, this is something that I hadn't really thought about before I moved back to Hong Kong. But of course, it's down the Ganges that the East India Company ferried the opium that was grown in Bihar and other parts of North India. And it's down the Ganges that it ferried the sepoys, the soldiers, who came and fought in the opium wars in Canton, in this part of the world. And in a sense, Hong Kong was established by the East India Company. And if you haven't already, I would really recommend reading the wonderful trilogy of historical novels about India, China, and Hong Kong by Amitav Ghosh, starting with Sea of Poppies, which I think the opening scene, if I remember rightly, is on the banks of the Ganges, and it's a woman who's tending her fields, her poppy fields, and they go down and they do a ceremony in the river. Yes, about 1/10 of the world's population depends on the Ganges. And one of the gurus I quote in the book, he says, the lives of 500 million people is not a small thing. And great civilizations rose and fell on its banks. And Ralph Fitch, in the time of Shakespeare, traveled down the river. I think his trip was actually mentioned in Macbeth, I believe, certainly one of Shakespeare's plays. And he marveled at what was then considered to be the world's greatest city, Pataliputra, which is now a rather miserable and much less prepossessing city called Patna, which is the capital of Bihar in one of the poorest parts of India. The Buddha found enlightenment in the Ganges Valley, and he taught on the river's banks. And international trade was conducted from the great ports at the mouth of the Ganges, such as Saptagram and Tamralipti, which we've now lost the memory of, more or less, on the Ganges Delta in the Bay of Bengal. But there's this, so that's the kind of the historical background. And this river is now under quite serious threat from sewage, human sewage, from toxic waste, from bacteria that carry antibiotic resistance genes, from fertilizer runoff from the fields, and from pesticides. And there's another form of danger for the river that we tend to forget about. It's not just what you put in, it's what you take out. And a large amount of the river water is taken out at successive dams along the Ganga and used mainly for irrigation, also for cities. And that means that there's often there are stretches of the river that are actually dry in the dry season, with no outside the monsoon season, with no water in them, which is obviously deadly for wildlife, but also very bad for the humans who live along the river lower downstream. Now, Narendra Modi, who's the current Prime Minister of India, the world's largest democracy, is a devout Hindu. He's promised to save the river. He even said he was called by God to save the river and by the river goddess herself. And he stood on the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi, his first speech after being elected overwhelmingly in 2014, his first Independence Day speech. And he stood up there and he said, I'm going to talk about the need for toilets and sanitation. And these are not things that you expect the Prime Minister to talk about at this great occasion. But here I am, I've been poor, and I know how important these things are. And so he is very much committed verbally to doing these things. And there's a question now about how much has been achieved. And if you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to answer, whether there is a debate as to whether he could have done more. And certainly in terms of the Ganges, very little has actually been achieved so far. But I don't want to be too pessimistic, because I do argue that you can save rivers because they've been saved before. When I was a kid growing up in London, my mother said, don't fall in the Thames, because if you fall in the Thames, you will have to go to hospital and your stomach will have to be pumped because the water is poisonous. And the Thames, which is where the Financial Times has its headquarters now, is, on the banks of the Thames, is now a clean river. You can see cormorants under Southwark Bridge, where our office is. There are fish in the river. There are even occasionally whales that wander up by accident past the Houses of Parliament. The Rhine has also been rescued in continental Europe. Coleridge wrote a poem about how disgusting the Rhine smelt. It's a sort of comic poem that I quote in the book. The Chicago River used to be absolutely disgusting, and when President Obama and Modi met for the first time at the White House in 2014, Obama told Modi, he said, they discussed environmental issues, and Obama said, well, the Chicago River used to be disgusting, but now you can catch fish in the Chicago River, and you can eat those fish. And Modi said, that's what I want for the Ganga. And, so there is hope that he will do something about it. There's another part of the book where I talk about the hope, in other words, the optimism that something can be done. And that is that Indian states like Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, they stage these massive religious festivals on the banks of the Ganges at regular intervals. In the case of West Bengal, it's at the mouth of the river called Ganga Sagar every year. Then the Kumbh Mela takes place at various places in different years on the Ganges river system. And I went to the one in 2013 at Allahabad, which was probably the world's largest ever gathering of human beings. The cell phone records recorded by Harvard University showed that 70 million people had been there, not on one day, admittedly, but in a 2-month period, because there's a kind of rotating city of people coming and going and bathing in the river. Millions of people bathing, I think 10 million on the first day at the confluence of the Yamuna River and the Ganges River. But the point about this is that the Uttar Pradesh authorities, they actually build a temporary city for 2 million people on the sandbanks in the middle of the Ganges. And it has roads, it has electricity, it has toilets, it has a police station, it has law and order, it has food, clean water, and everything works. And it's not very expensive. And the point about that is that it can be done. The negative side, if you like, is that Indians will say, yes, but that's the Indian wedding syndrome, which means that when you really need to pull together for one big event, you can do it. And that's what happens for an Indian wedding, this massive occasion of several days of celebrations. But for everyday life, we just can't do it. And I think that attitude needs to be changed, and people need to understand that if they can do it for a special occasion, they can actually do it every day and have all those things, whether it's sanitation or electricity, every day, and not at a great cost. I'll kind of stop pretty soon. I'm just going to show a very few slides for you, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I just want to say one thing about one of the problems for the river is that a lot of Indians that I met in the course of researching this book would tell you there's no problem with pollution in the Ganges, because the Ganges is very, very pure. She is a spiritual, holy goddess, and nothing we do, and at this point, the person you're talking to will chuck a plastic bag full of garbage into the river. Nothing we do makes any difference at all. And I say, and environmentalists say, and indeed smart Hindu holy men will say, this is nonsense. And the reason it's nonsense is that the very spiritual strength of a river, and in this case the Ganges, derives not from some sort of remote, weird spiritual thing that we know nothing about, but from her very physical properties. the reason that we worship rivers, and we used to worship them in Britain centuries ago, is that they are life givers. They provide life in the form of water, in the form of fertility. And once you take that away by killing the river, by poisoning the river is no longer a life giver, and therefore the reasons for her or its spiritual strength disappear. So the physical attributes of the river are very important, and they're actually the basis for the spiritual attributes of the river. And that's what you have to argue with people and convince them about. So I'll just show a very few slides. Basically, we're starting at the top, the source of the river, and this is Gomukh, and that in the distance under that snowy peak is the glacier where the Ganges emerges from a ice cave which is known as Gomukh, the mouth of the cow. And it actually does look a bit like the mouth of the cow. In fact, that's me, sorry about that, but that was the best picture we could get. It was a rather towering walk, and it was actually dusk. It was about to be dark, but behind me you can see rather distantly the mouth of the cow there. And this is one of the gurus who lives up there in Gangotri, which is about 25 kilometers downstream from the source, and it's a holy city where the Ganges is worshipped. And this is one of the ceremonies that takes place every evening. As you can see, people light gaudy-colored lights, but this is a fire ceremony that takes place and is, in fact, I think, described in quite some detail by Diana Eck in her book about India, and the spiritual nature of India. That's just a map, just to give you a rough idea. So I haven't got a pointer, but you can see the river rises on the left in the foothills of the Himalayas, and unusually for a great Asian river, it doesn't rise in Tibet, in China. It rises inside Indian territory, and then goes across in a roughly easterly, southeasterly direction across India into Bangladesh, and becomes the delta, which spreads out across India and Bangladesh. That's at Devprayag, which is the confluence of two of the source streams of the Ganges. And these are the great floods of 2013, in which something like 6,500 people died. Nobody knows exactly how many. Many of them were pilgrims, and this was thought to be because of climate change, but essentially there was a massive cloudburst, which probably would have been in the form of snow in the old days, but in this case came in the form of very heavy rain, and it just washed away many things, including this statue of Shiva at Rishikesh. And it was an extraordinarily powerful, and you can still see the traces. Bridges were swept away, villages were swept away, encampments were swept away, ashrams were swept away, and as I said, thousands of people were killed. It was known as the Himalayan tsunami in 2013. This is an ashram on the banks of the Ganga at Rishikesh, where they perform this ceremony every day. And this particular guru is quite active in trying to protect the river. This is upstream from Haridwar, just to give you an idea of the river as we head. We're now we've reached, I guess, the plains of North India. We've come out of the steep area of the foothills. These are the Naga sadhus, the naked holy men who are first to go into the water at the great festivals like the Kumbh Mela. And this is in Allahabad, where the Yamuna meets the Ganga, where it meets the Ganges. This is in Hastinapur, which is, again, further downstream. We're heading now towards sort of central North India. This is just before Varanasi. This is the fort at Chunar, where a woman is growing her vegetables. It's a Mughal fort that was obviously taken over by the British. And at this point, the river curves north towards Benares, Varanasi, before continuing on its journey to the sea. And you do see dolphins, freshwater dolphins, in a lot of places in India. And right here behind me, where I'm taking the picture, there are actually some dolphins playing in the river, or fishing in the river, actually. This is Varanasi, the famous city. If you haven't been, I urge you to go. Too many tourists go only to Rajasthan, and they miss a lot. I mean, if you get up at dawn and look around Varanasi, you will be astonished by what you see. It's just an astounding place to be before and as the sun rises. This is the same. This is the boatman's temple in Varanasi, celebrating the boatman who took Ram across the river when he was looking for his wife Sita. And this is so. this means it's a famous film from 1985. This means Ram, as in the god Ram, your Ganges is being or has been sullied. And this was a famous movie, slightly more raunchy poster than would probably be allowed by the censors nowadays. But there you go. And it's that is Ganga. That is the goddess Ganga, and she symbolizes, and her fate. She's abused basically as she travels downstream by various corrupt holy men, evil businessmen. She's sold into prostitution. People are constantly trying to rape her and generally abuse her. And eventually she finds happiness with her loved one, this guy with a rather weird kind of Austrian hat, and ends up in happiness in Calcutta, and the bad guys mostly die. But it's a lovely movie, and it has great songs in it as well, and it's a kind of symbol of, she is it's an allegory really about the river and how the river is abused and how it needs to be saved. And it came out around the time of the first plan to save the Ganges from Rajiv Gandhi, the former prime minister. And this is a slightly more demure version of Ganga, at a statue next to a barrage that the British built in Aurora. And these are the old sailing vessels that used to ply the Ganges. Sadly, now we're very much motorized, and you won't see these anymore. That's Modi 2014 making that speech I referred to, talking about how he was going to save, help India and improve sanitation. That's the rather disgusting Yamuna River near Delhi. Yamuna is a big tributary of the Ganga, and as you can see, it's kind of spumous and rather disgusting. That's more disgusting stuff. That's what goes into the river. This is from the dry lands in the Ganges plain in the Bundelkhand, which is a notoriously dry area, and there is only one well in this village, which is 300 years old, which is this one, that produces sweet water for something like 3,000 people. Essentially the water table in the whole of North India is heavily overexploited, and the other wells in this area have very salty water, as I can attest because I tasted it. This was Delhi 2016, I think. Could have been 2015. Anyway, this was when some Jat Rathas in Haryana, for reasons totally unrelated to the river, staged a protest, and they cut the main canal carrying water to Delhi. And it was a complete disaster. And they actually called out the army for the first time in a long time to restore order. They shot 2 of the protesters, and they started, as you can see, repairing the canal. And this was pretty serious because it was the height of summer. It was extremely hot. 25 million people without water, even for a couple of days, was not funny. And they did actually manage to restore the water supply fairly quickly. And luckily they had an alternative canal that provided a little bit of water for the city. That's a gharial. I was talking about the weird and wonderful crocodiles. They're extremely rare, endangered species. That's an actual one that I photographed on the Chambal River, which is south of Delhi, and joins the Yamuna and then joins the Ganges at Allahabad. And there's a whole chapter really on wildlife and on how the Chambal essentially cleans the Ganges by cleaning the Yamuna. If you just let the Yamuna go into the Ganges, it would be pure filth. But because of the Chambal, which is a very clean river, it's actually okay. Now we're getting downstream. This is the Hooghly going towards Calcutta, and that's Calcutta. And this is the Ganga Sagar I mentioned. This is the annual festival at the mouth of the Ganges. This is actually on an island called Sagar Island, this happens every year. This is one of the, again, the naked sadhus. I haven't shown him full frontal. You'll probably be glad to hear. Again, these events are just fantastically colourful and interesting. And I think I was about the only foreigner there, apart from a couple of Hare Krishnas, and just delightful. These guys are rather fun. These are traditional Bengali minstrels, and they play this little instrument called, I think one of them has got it, has he? Maybe not. There's a one-stringed instrument called an ektara, and they've got these drums as well. And they sing these absolutely beautiful, haunting melodies. And I was with a Bengali-speaking colleague, and I said, what are they singing? That's such a beautiful song. And she said, they're singing, please use the toilets and wash your hands afterwards. And it was actually a government propaganda message. And you'll see that they've actually been paid by the regional government to do this. But again, this is a sign that, and actually this festival was very clean, and people did use the toilets, which they didn't have at home. And because the state government basically said, there will be no dirt, there will be no plastic going into the river or the sea, and there wasn't. It was really effective, and this is what I mean when I say it is possible to be optimistic. Now we're at the very mouth of the river on the Bay of Bengal. This is honey being collected from the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove swamp, and these guys who collect the honey are often at risk from being killed by tigers. About 20 or 30 people are killed every year by tigers when looking for honey or wood or other natural products. It's a beautiful area of wildlife and natural resources, and the Royal Bengal tiger and fish and dolphins and plant life. It's absolutely stunning. But very few tourists go there anymore, but they should. She's fishing for prawn seed with a mosquito net, which is a little bit damaging because you catch everything as well as the prawn seed. And this, again, we're heading towards the sea now. This is the very edge of India. It's a photo by my friend Swastik Pal. These islands, they appear and they disappear and they reappear. And the land is constantly changing because of the monsoon, because of the river flow, because of silt coming and going, and because of cyclones. And I think that's it. This is, again, we're heading right towards the open sea now in the Bay of Bengal, and that's the end of it. So I thank you very much, and I'm sort of happy to, just lastly, I mean, the point about the Ganges is that it is a living river, although some of its tributaries are not. And as I say in the book, Indians are killing the Ganges, and the Ganges in turn is killing Indians, and killing them with the sewage and the same sewage and toxic waste that is put into the river, and that's why we have to stop this kind of nasty cycle. So the book is it's a story of, and it is, I think, on sale outside, yes, and I'm happy to sign them, but certainly happy to sell them. It's the story of a river and of how India can learn the lessons from other rivers that have been saved, and indeed, I think, importantly, teach its own lessons. Because every river is completely different. The Ganges is a very, very different river from the Rhine and the Thames. Apart from anything else, it's much more seasonal. And so in a way, this is the kind of a story of India. You can never say you've written the story of India because it's such an extraordinary place with so many stories to tell. But it's a story of India and a story of its many triumphs and disasters. And as Churchill said of the Thames in Britain, the Ganges is the golden thread of Indian history. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Fascinating stuff. Before we open the floor, can I just ask you, you mentioned that from the beginning, Modi said that it was going to be his priority, but number one, what has been done, and number two, what could be done? I know there was this program of a toilet for everyone by 2019, for example. Is this happening?
It is happening very, very, very slowly. I mean, India is an astonishingly difficult place to get things done, as I think any businessman here might be able to attest. And a lot of people, including me, thought that Narendra Modi would be the person to achieve things, to implement things. Because often, there are many plans. There have been plans for 30 or 40 years to save the Ganges. We had Ganga Action Plan 1, Ganga Action Plan 2, Yamuna Action Plan 1, Yamuna Action Plan 2, the gaps and the yaps. And, one of the environmental groups said this is all just yap, 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 because nothing actually happens. So the great difficulty in India is not so much formulating plans, although that is sometimes problematic, but it's actually implementing those plans. So there have been sanitation plans in India for many, many years. And most famously, Uttar Pradesh, through which the Ganges runs, it's a country of more than 200 million people, bigger than Brazil. If it was a country, it would be about the world's 5th largest nation. They had a program, and they claimed to have increased the use of toilets from 20% of the population to 80% over 10 years between 2001 and 2011. And they spent $660 million of government money on this program. And every year they reported higher coverage, and everyone said, this is fantastic, you're doing really well. And then, unfortunately, fortunately, I guess, the Census Department did a census in 2011, nothing to do with toilets, but obviously that was one of the questions they asked is, does your house have a toilet? And lo and behold, not a single toilet had actually been built. All the money had been taken, and the coverage of the population was exactly where it was 10 years earlier, i.e. about 20%. So, you know, all that money was stolen. It wasn't like the money was wasted a bit. All the money was stolen. And it was stolen probably you know, by senior officials, by junior officials, by village officials. I mean, who knows, you know. And one of the problems is that people are just not held accountable in India for the things that need to be done and then are not done. So, sorry, that probably doesn't answer your question. But
no, it does the first part,
yeah.
which is what is being done,
Yeah.
and I understand not much.
Yeah.
But since you've looked at the situation so closely, what do you think could be done? What are there some easy options? I mean, probably not, but the most obvious ones.
Yeah, I think there are. You know, I mean, there are definitely easy wins that you can do. They're not cheap, but you know, in India they wouldn't necessarily be that expensive. And I think the main thing is to remember that when you do a good thing to help a river, you actually end up doing a lot of other good things at the same time. So there are all these kind of co-benefits that make complete sense. And there's nothing controversial about cleaning the Ganges, because not only do you save the holy river of India, you know, for religious purposes, but you also improve sanitation, which means that you're saving the lives of hundreds and hundreds of children. I mean, you know, something like, at the last count, 1,500 children a day under 5 were dying across India. That's not all in the Ganges basin, but half of it probably is. We're dying from totally preventable, stupid, you know, forms of diarrhea, and this is just from poor sanitation, and it can be solved by improving sanitation. And it's not just about building toilets, it's about building sewage farms. So you then have another benefit, which is by building this kind of infrastructure that India desperately, desperately needs. And you know, China has, on the whole, done this. By building this kind of infrastructure, you also create thousands and thousands, millions, in fact, of jobs that are desperately needed. And you know, we've seen this with roads. So India's become better at building roads than it was, and that's created a lot of jobs for a lot of unskilled people. So that is a good thing. Now, if they could do the same with sanitation, you know, drainage, sewage treatment, it's not romantic, but it's really, really important. And it's not controversial. There is nobody going around, no politician going around saying, we mustn't clean the Ganges, this is an outrageous Hindu plot. It's good for everybody, you know, so, yeah.
So, questions from the floor? Please just raise your hand and introduce yourself. We have a question right there. Please.
Oh, just waving.
Oh, no, oh, sorry, Joyce was saying
just
hello.
Waving. Just waving in a
okay,
friend.
Eric here. Okay, and Simon.
Thanks, Eric Wisher. Very interesting, Victor. Thank you for the talk. I'm just interested in the book itself. I think you said, how many years did it take you to research it?
Well, I sort of started without knowing I was going to write a book the day I arrived in India. So I lived in Delhi for 4 years. I was based in Delhi, and I traveled around India, including many times.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask,
Yeah.
could you take us
Yeah.
a bit through the research? And what were you when you were researching the book, what were you specifically looking for?
Yeah, I think sort of the answer to this question, what I was looking for was the answer to this question, why is it that a river that is so important spiritually and so worshipped, actually, I mean, you know, she is worshipped as a goddess, why is it that this river is also abused by the very same people who worship her? And you know, and I've sort of explained part of it, I think, by this notion of purity that is untouchable. And in fact, I quote a lot of people in the book who try to explain how this has played a part in their own lives. You know, there's a guy called B.D. Tripathi, who I think is a professor of, I can't remember, he's environmental science, I think, at Banaras Hindu University in Banaras. And he describes in the 1970s, he's swimming and there's all this filth in the water, there are sort of dead animals. And so he starts measuring the dirt in the water, you know, the pollutants in the water, the bacteria in the water. And his mother is just outraged, and she says, you know, how can you do this? You know, the Ganga is the most pure. You cannot possibly say that she is polluted. And he says, look, I'm a scientist. What do you want me to do? You know, she is polluted, and we have to stop polluting her. But, you know, so there are kind of huge cultural problems. On the other hand, what should be possible, I think, is a sort of, is using the Ganges' spiritual importance as a kind of lever for persuading everyone that this is something that they should do. And you know, which is what they do when they have religious festivals. People do actually contribute. But no, so the short answer to I didn't do a journey from start to finish down the Ganges in a boat, which is what Eric Newby did in the 1960s. which, I mean, it's a wonderful book, and it's very funny as well as being very sort of sympathetic and descriptive about India. I just went to all the places that I thought were important that I could go to and interviewed people there. And one of the depressing things I found was that when I looked at sort of earlier books about the Ganges or that touched on the subject of the river, we were all talking to the same sort of 12 people, and they were the same 20 or 30 years earlier. So one of the things that bothers me is that a lot of young Indians are not really engaged in this, what should be a really important mission, you know, and somehow that needs to change too, I think. Edith has, oh, sorry, yeah.
So thanks, Victor. I was just going to make the obvious comparison with China. If you think about kind of the problem with Chinese waterways, I'd venture that a lot of them would probably come down to industrialization, bad public policy, the adoption of huge hydro projects. From what you told us today, that didn't sound fundamentally like the Indian problem. So if you were kind of to categorize it fundamentally, is this a problem of sanitation, the consequences of industrialization? Is it fundamentally public policy failure? What is the root issue that we're dealing with?
Yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, I didn't talk much about industrial pollution. It's true that compared to China and compared to Southeast Asia, and I think Japan, Taiwan, Korea, industrial pollution, and probably the US and Britain as well, industrial pollution is not quite as big a problem in India as it is in those countries. And one reason for that is that India is, or has been up until now, less industrialized. However, for some of the tributaries and indeed some parts of the river, it is a big deal. So Kanpur, for example, has a massive tannery industry. And again, I write about this in the book. And tanning produces extremely toxic waste products, which are carcinogenic heavy metals like chromium and chromium-6, I think it's called. So you have huge problems that exist. But you know, and that's actually another easy fix, I think. Or it is not impossible to reduce those effluents to zero. And that's something that could be done with actually surprisingly little money. And the government, again, has talked about it, and it has plans, and there have been many sort of attempts to do this. And actually some of the tannery owners, who are, of course, mostly Muslims, because, Hindus, clearly, the cow is holy, and you don't want to, even if it's buffalo hide, you don't really want to be in the business of tanning. And some of the tannery owners, some of the more enlightened ones, are really keen to reduce their emissions, their effluent, to zero, and they've started to do that. But again, the sort of corruption of the state government, the ineffectiveness of municipal governments just makes it very hard to achieve things. I mean, a good example of this is in Kanpur, which used to be known as Cawnpur for the British. It's always been a big leather place. It was a big leather production, for horses, saddles and boots and stuff like that in the days of the British and the East India Company. But they have, they've set up a kind of central, a common effluent treatment plant, and all the tanneries are supposed to do some primary treatment, then send it off to this common plant before the clean wastewater, as it were, is put into the river. But all kinds of things go wrong with it. There's a power cut, so the pumps don't work, and there should be there should be generators that provide power so the pumps can carry on working. But guess what? Somebody sold the fuel. The diesel for the pumps has been stolen and sold on the black market. This happens all the time. And people, and I interview people about this, and so there are sort of endless problems, and they ultimately they come down to corruption. They come down to inefficient government, the lack of accountability. Civil servants are constantly moved around. The state pollution control boards are notoriously ineffective. The Central Pollution Control Board isn't very effective either. So, somebody will come in, a senior official, and say, do this, and people will say, yes, sir, and they'll do it, for a few months, and then they'll stop, and no one holds them accountable. So, but I wouldn't say that industrial pollution was not an issue. It is a big issue. And there's another big issue that we don't know anything about, which is because there's not enough data, pesticides. Pesticide runoff is a huge problem. And they've measured extremely high levels of pesticides in residues in the soil where our vegetables were grown when we lived in Delhi, and in the blubber of the dolphins. These are huge problems, and we just have no data. So nobody knows how dangerous this stuff really is. So it's true that human sewage is a kind of big issue, and it's it's more obviously solvable, but there are other problems as well. Yeah. So I think Edith had a. Oh, are we,
So,
Edith Perry. So, yes, I was reminded of The River Runs Black by Elizabeth
absolutely,
Economy,
yeah.
and the problems of Chinese rivers. So the question, if I can take a slightly different tack than Simon, is just what are there international agencies or governmental sort of governmental institutions that are trying to take charge of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you were here when the videos were rolling before lunch or just as we were eating lunch, but one of the people pictured there, the guy with the ponytail, used to be head of the World Bank in India, and he's called Onno Rule. He's a Dutchman, and he was, one of the World Bank's biggest program was $1 billion program to help the Ganges. But very little of that money has actually been spent because it's just hard for organizations like the World Bank to sort of persuade the Indian government to take their money. I mean, this is one of the sort of fundamental problems, I guess, or one of the conundrums that you come across in India. The Japanese have lots of funds available for cleaning the Ganges. I think other governments do as well. I'm sure the British do. So there is a lot of goodwill from international organizations such as the World Bank, from foreign governments, and from Indian institutions. The Indian government has allocated $3 billion over the next few years to this Ganges cleanup. So the issue is, first of all, spending the money, and, well, more importantly, spending the money effectively in a way that actually produces results. So there have been little elements of progress. I think something like 131, I forget the precise number, but real-time water pollutant monitoring devices funded by the World Bank have been put at various places along the river. But the problem, the last time I looked, was that this data wasn't made available to anyone. So, I asked the World Bank, I said, well, why can't we just see the data? If they're real time, presumably it'd be really good to see what's happening in real time. And that wasn't available, presumably because the Indian government didn't want it to be available. So, there are sort of small signs of progress, but the big sort of push has certainly not yet started, I think. What's started is kind of slightly superficial things about beautification. It's like planting trees along the banks of the Seine. It's very nice, but it's not everything. If the river's dirty, that's not really going to help. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry. You choose. You're the boss.
Sorry, here and here after. So please, the mic.
Thank you. I'm Angus Forsyth, resident of Hong Kong. How much is actually on Narendra Modi's plate now, which is diverting him from this absolutely vital task, which you've so adequately and eloquently identified, and which he shared with you, basically, from the podium 4 years ago? I just read that, in fact, he's been elevated now into some kind of major position in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, that's something invented by China to stop Islamic terrorism in Xinjiang. And it's spread and spread and spread, and Russia's there and India's there. But India is the second biggest, substantially almost the biggest country in the world, and certainly the biggest democracy. It's going to be distracting for him to push him into that, to make him want to do something about controlling it and having a kind of face-off with China about it, and so on and so on and so on. So, I mean, back to square one, back to basics. Where are the Ganges basics going to go with this?
It's a very good question, and I think what I would do is just take you back to my point about the co-benefits, because Modi has spent a lot of time focusing on foreign policy. He has spent a lot of time focusing on business issues, the GST, the demonetization, and so on. And all these are important, whether good or bad. We can argue about them, in another forum. But he has spent a lot of time focusing on those issues. But his mandate actually affects a lot of the things that would help the Ganges, and his mandate was to help young people get jobs. I don't think he's forgotten that. And India, there's something like 12 million people coming onto the workforce newly each year in India, and only a tiny fraction of new jobs are created. If you have a sort of massive campaign to clean the Ganges, you help that. So he does, I think, need to focus more on issues like social issues like education, like healthcare. All of these are in a really catastrophic, state. Education, healthcare, and also environmental issues. You've probably heard about the air pollution in Delhi, which is, the test match they stopped play the other day. Sri Lanka basically said they couldn't breathe. The Sri Lankan team said they couldn't breathe anymore. So he does have a lot of issues on his plate. But I would argue that the issues that affect the environment are actually issues that should play to his political strengths, as it were. People elected him because they wanted work, they wanted jobs, they wanted a better life. And I think if he focuses on things like sanitation and education and healthcare and all these are things that essentially help the Ganges as well and the environment, I actually think, and they are things that produce results in the long term, not the short term. But he's quite likely to get another term in a couple of years' time in the next election. So he can actually benefit from that and benefit the country by doing that. Yeah, well...
We still have time for one or two...
We'll talk about Donald another time, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Mark Michelson, IMA Asia. I was going to ask you about Donald Trump too, but I won't.
Oh,
won't this time.
I have views.
Yeah. Just to explore a little bit what you were saying before, not only the political atmosphere, but the attitudes toward pollution in India and elsewhere. You mentioned all the plastics from not only from the Pearl River, but from elsewhere in Hong Kong. We still haven't moved very far. As you mentioned, young people perhaps not being as interested in this as you think they might. Is there enough popular support to move this forward, let alone with the politicians, because they do react to that? And is there enough being done to get them online? Because obviously this will be for jobs, for health, for all sorts of reasons. It's very positive, but there doesn't seem to be great passion.
Yeah, I think Hong Kong's sort of slightly laissez-faire attitude to the environment is quite shocking, because it is one of the richest cities in the world and it has one of the worst records for all kinds of issues like recycling and so on, and that is desperately sad. I don't know really. I mean, I think people. I think it's actually a matter of leadership, and that's why it was so encouraging to hear Modi saying these things. When he stood on the walls of the Red Fort, 2014, first Independence Day speech, people thought he was going to come up with a Hindu nationalist message, which would be, anti-Muslim. His enemies were really worried about it. And his friends were worried about it too. They thought, let's hope he focuses. And to everyone's astonishment, he actually came up with a really good speech that was completely, not at all what people expected. It wasn't even really about business. It was about helping the poor. And that's, if you clean the Ganges, you help the poor. People who live on the Ganges are poor. The people of Bihar are among the poorest people in the world. So I think a lot of it is not just about people, sort of a popular movement, although that certainly helps. It's also about leadership. And people, if they have that kind of leadership, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether, if we had a government in Hong Kong that said, you've all got to recycle from tomorrow, it would happen. People in Britain said it would never work. It worked overnight. It's absolutely simple. You just have to have a government that says, this is what you have to do. In the same way that if you have a government in India that really pushes certain important issues like proper healthcare, proper education, it would take time, but it would actually work. So.
Well, on this slightly hopeful note,
yes.
It's time to say thank you very much to Victor for this fascinating talk. Don't forget that you can buy his books and get them signed.
Buy two.
And yes, give him a big round of applause.
Thank you.